Okay, so we are ready to start chapter 6 on process costing. So job costing was a little bit easier than process costing. Process costing gets a little tricky, but we're going to step through it. So you should see a chapter 6 practice out under unit 2. So you can go ahead and load that in Cengage. So for those of you that have taken managerial more recently, then you might remember some about process costing. So here's when process costing is for when whatever we manufacture or sell is pretty uniform as far as what we're doing, so it's not unique, it's all kind of the same, the process is the same, each item is the same cost. So with job costing, we were tracking specific jobs, the labor, materials and overhead to each job specifically throughout its life, I guess, from materials being requisitioned into work in process and then on to being finished. So with process costing, though, we can have more than one work in process account. We're not going to deal with that too much. We're going to look at an example just to kind of see how costs flow. They're all still just typical work in process T accounts, they increase on the debit, decrease on the credit. They are going to flow through different processes now. So it could be whatever we're making, again, when we're doing process costing, they're uniform, they're the same. So, say we produce pens, we produce all the same pens, and so the process is the same. We may have differences as we get to the end, like, oh, these are blue or these are pink or purple or whatever. But the process as far as the ink going in them, the plastic structure is pretty much the same as we go through. So if we have the type of product that's pretty uniform, then we would use process costing. Where basically, they all cost the same per unit. But the problem we get into sounds pretty easy, right? We just take our total cost divided by however many units and get a per unit cost. But it's not that simple, because we know as we go through period to period, we have all these different work and processes. So how do we figure out how much we actually completed in the current period? Because we started with this many, we did this many throughout the period, we ended with this many. So we have to be able to calculate on average what we call an equivalent unit of production to figure out our costs. So the whole goal in chapter 6 is to deal with finding equivalent units of production and then being able to assign unit costs. So being able to assign the period costs. So we're going to take all the costs incurred in the period, materials, labor, and overhead. So we're still dealing with product costs. And then we just want to give it like a unit cost. So the tricky part comes in, again, from managerial. We looked at the weighted average method, which we're still going to look at again in here as a nice refresher. But we're also going to look at FIFO, first in, first out. That gets a little trickier. I know, at least in my managerial, I didn't cover it. But again, we're in cost, so we get into some of those more advanced topics. And I'll talk a little bit more about it as we go through. But basically, FIFO is more accurate because we're dealing with only the current period's costs, and we're not carrying costs over from period to period. So if we use the FIFO method to calculate units, equivalent units of production, and assign process costs, our costs are more accurate. But weighted average, of course, is easier. So the trade-off, right? It's always the more difficult one is the better option in accounting, it feels like, right? So we're going to look at how to account for units completed in the period, calculate equivalent units of production, and then assign costs. So your notes are a little bit longer for this chapter because I wanted you to have more information. So as you kind of look through the notes, we talked about equivalent units of production. So all equivalent units of production is taking like all of the costs that we've actually incurred in the period and determining, given that materials, labor, and overhead that we put into production, how many units could have been finished 100%? Because in order to calculate costs, we need to come up with a completion. We have to have finished units. So we calculate what's called equivalent units of production. And this just helps us assign costs. So we look at, given these, how much could we have finished if everything that was started was finished? Okay. So let's take a look at some. This first one's really just dealing with cost flows. So this one, we have Lamont Company produced 80,000 machine parts for diesel engines. There were no beginning or ending work in process, so it makes it simple. And they're showing us our costs for May. So we have materials, labor, and overhead for 3 different departments. Again, these are all work in process accounts. So first they go through molding, then they're transferred to grinding. From grinding, they go to finishing. So this is common with process costing, that we'll have more than one work in process account. So when it's talking about calculating costs transferred out, well, again, there's no beginning or ending work in process, so we don't have to balance anything, right? So for molding, all of the costs, these are the only costs, and they're all transferred out. Okay, so there's no ending work in process. So for the month of May, everything that was in molding gets transferred out. So how much total costs get transferred out of molding? 40,000, good. We just add up materials, labor, and overhead. Okay, so that 40,000 then gets transferred into grinding, which then has its own materials, labor, and overhead added in. Because that's what you'll see in each different process, which makes sense, right? You're going to have different machinery, different materials that are necessary for each work in process. So for grinding, you would add up the grinding costs and add in that molding, because that's going from molding into grinding. So what are my grinding costs? Very good, 68,000. And then same for finishing. We would take all 68,000 plus all the finishing costs. 99, perfect, 99,000. Okay. So that's how process costing works. And these costs, are staying together, and we'll determine unit cost at a later date. This is just kind of showing us cost flows through the different work and processes. And then if you scroll down, it just wants us to do the journal entries first, and then we'll do cost added here in a minute. But to journalize those, again, they're typical work in process accounts. So when costs go in, we debit. When they're transferred out, we credit. So the first one we would want to do is show costs going from molding into grinding. So I would truly debit my work in process for grinding and credit work in process for molding for that 40,000. So that 40,000 cost was transferred out of molding into grinding. So then grinding has 68,000 in costs as a debit, all total, and we're going to transfer that to finishing. So to do that, we would just debit work in process finishing for the 68,000 now, and credit work in process grinding. So now all the costs that were in grinding gets transferred into work in process finishing. Well, finishing is our last work in process. So once items are truly finished, what account would they be transferred to? Finished goods, very good. So that flow stays the same. So then we would debit finished goods and credit work in process finishing for the total cost, the 99,000. So really, between job costing and process costing, your cost flows really aren't different. You just have multiple work in process accounts. So instead of just flowing into one work in process, we've now divvied it up into others. But they're still coming out of materials, being requisitioned, all the costs are added into work in process. We just have costing added into different processes. But once they're finished, they still get transferred to finished goods. And when they get sold, transferred to cost of goods sold. Okay. The last little journal entry is just asking for the costs added. So all they're showing there is we just want to show when we transferred all of those three costs into the grinding account, okay? For that, it's just the materials, labor, and overhead for just this month. So that's the 28,000. So it'd be basically just these three added up, materials, labor, plus overhead for just a month. So we're just showing the journal entry showing those costs being added into grinding for May, which again, you would just debit work in process for grinding for the full amount. And then it depends on what it is, like materials, we would credit for the 5,200, showing those materials were moving out of materials into work in process. And then for the labor, we could credit payroll or payroll payable, probably 8,800. And then we would have our overhead control credited the 14,000, showing the overhead applied. Okay, so that's just showing the costs added to grinding during the month. And that, again, hasn't changed from what we did before. We were debiting those costs to the work in process. Let's see, it has a what if. It says, what if the grinding department had an ending work in progress or process of 12,000? How much would the costs be transferred out? Well, we transferred out 68,000, but they're saying, what if 12,000 of those were still in work in process? That's all it's asking. So how many would we have transferred out then? 56,000, very good. We just subtract. If we had 12 in ending work in process, then we would have only transferred out 50,000 or 56,000. 68,000 minus the 12,000. And then they're asking for the journal entry. Well, it's really just changing the amount. Okay, you would show work in process finishing, 56,000, and coming out of grinding, 56,000. So if we were transferring less costs into finishing and therefore into finished goods, how does that affect finished goods? It's decreased. Very good. So we would decrease by the 12,000 because that 12,000 cost is staying in the work in process. Which obviously this little example would be an ideal world where, you know, we started with no beginning balances. All the costs that were added got, you know, used up and all the product got completed. That's a good way to look at cost flows, but obviously it's not an accurate representation of how product flows. Any questions on that one? Okay. This next one is just looking at no work in process inventories and dealing with unit costs. So we're just kind of doing kind of an easy one on this one. It says, Lysine Therapy has a physical therapist who performs electromechanical treatments. What does that even mean for its patients? Electromechanical. That's kind of scary. I don't know about that. During April, Lysine had the following cost and output information. So drug materials were $750. Hygienist salary was $42.50. Overhead was $5,000, and they did 100 treatments. Sorry, I can't get over that. I'm going to have to Google that later. See if that's real. So it asked to calculate the cost per treatment for April. Well, there were no beginning work in processes. This was more of a service type, you know, really. You're looking at, although there's some materials involved, probably, you know, gowns and medical equipment. We're really dealing more with like a service type outfit. So in this case, if these were the only costs, you can truly just add the cost and divide by the number of treatments, right? You're just getting a typical cost per treatment. So what is the cost per treatment? 100, very good. So we took the three costs, materials plus salary, which is labor plus overhead, and divided by 100. So the total cost per treatment for April was $100. So what's the total cost of services sold for April? Yeah, 10,000. We would just take 100 times 100. $100 a service at 100 services. It's 10,000. So again, process costing can be done on service type companies, but you usually don't have incomplete services, so it's a little bit easier to calculate. It makes it a lot easier, actually, not a little bit, right? So it's pretty straightforward. Unit cost, and there you go. It says, what if Lansing found a way to reduce overhead costs by 20%? How would this affect the profit per treatment? So if overhead's 5,000 and we reduced it by 20,000, how much are we reducing it? 1,000, good. So really, to figure out per treatment, we would just take that 1,000 and divide it by the 100 treatments. You should get, profits would do what? Increase, perfect, by $10 per treatment. Because you've lowered, I just calculated how much the overhead reduction would be. So 5,000 times 20%. So our overhead went down $1,000 divided by total number of treatments. That's $10 increase of profit per treatment. So again, costing with more of a service-driven world works a lot easier because there's not ending work in process or beginning. Okay, that one's pretty easy, right? We'll move on to the third one. So here we're just getting into equivalent units of production, okay, with an ending work in process. So Fleming, and Johnson, a local CPA firm, provided the following data for returns processed for March. So beginning, there were no work in process. We'll kind of baby step into having work in process. We started 6,000 in the period, completed 5,000. So 1,000 are in the ending work in process, and those are 50% complete. So they're always going to tell you how complete they are. So there's our total production costs too. So the first thing we always do is what we call a physical flow schedule to account for the units that we need to cost out, okay? So it always starts with, we basically went, and this is on your notes too in the very top here, you have units to account for. You're going to look at beginning work in process plus what was started in the period, and that should always equal units completed and transferred out plus the ending work in process. So we're just looking at, those should equal each other. So we're going to do that reconciliation just to make sure we're accounting for the right numbers. So the first step is units in beginning work in process. Well, in this case, they told us there were 0. And it asks for units started. And they told us that was 6,000. So all total in this period, we have 6,000 units to account for. Pretty easy when we have no beginning work in process. From those units, we know that there's from beginning work in process, we have 0. Okay. And then we started and completed 5,000. So there we're actually calculating how many were completed and transferred out. So that doesn't really show on your little notes here, but that's calculating, what was completed and transferred out. So it's just a breakdown. So 5,000 units were started and completed, or actually just completed and transferred out. And then we have 1,000 left in ending work in process. They give us that. Okay. And that also equals 6,000. So we've reconciled there. So of the total 6,000 units we had available in this period, 5,000 were completed and transferred out, and 1,000 are in ending work in process. Well, again, the whole point of trying to, in order to assign a unit cost, we need to calculate equivalent units of production. So the equivalent unit schedule, what we're looking at is obviously if they were completed and transferred out, they are 100% complete. Okay, so for your equivalent units of production, you're always going to calculate it on started and completed, or not started and completed, completed and transferred out. and the ending work in process, okay? So the first line will just be units completed. And that was 5,000 from our schedule and what they told us. We completed 5,000 units. Well, those are 100% complete, okay? The ending work in process, we had 1,000 units total in ending work in process, and they were 50% complete. So to calculate equivalent units of production, we truly just take the 1,000 times 50%. So that's obviously 500. Okay, so that's the equivalent units of production for the ending work in process. So our total equivalent units for this period are just those two added together. Okay, so we take what was completed, which is 100% complete, plus whatever's an ending times the percent completed is, and that gives us our equivalent units. So again, all equivalent units means is given the amount of costs we put in the period, the labor, the materials, and the overhead. If everything would have been completed, we would have had the resources, the costs to complete 5,500 units. Okay. But we know we're still, the thing is those ending work in process, they still need additional costs to complete. They still need labor and conversion costs, labor and overhead to complete. So that's why, you know, there's still more costs associated with those 1,000 that are remaining. So to calculate the costs for this period, that's why we do the equivalent units of production. So we want to know how many units we could have done to completion with the resources we added this period. That makes sense? Okay. So it says, what if the ending work in process is 80% complete? Well, how would that affect our physical flow and the equivalent units? So changing the degree of completion, does that affect my physical flow, this up here? No, it has no effect, does not affect the physical flow. However, the equivalent unit schedule, it does affect it, correct? So it is affected. And how many equivalent units would be in ending work in process? 800, very good, 80% of the 1,000. And that would do what to the total output? Increase, perfect. And how much would that be? 5,800, good. So that's just looking at equivalent units of production. Once we calculate those equivalent units, we can establish, and we're going to look at that here in a minute, like a unit cost and be able to establish like costs for, maybe basically get to a unit cost for the period. Okay. So those were the easier ones. Let's look at tackling some others. So on this one, we want to do a production report, which does the physical flow still, like reconciles physical flow, but then goes on and figures out cost assignment, okay? So here we're looking at the mixing department. So Tamar Company produces vitamin energy drinks. The mixing department is the first process department and obviously mixes all the ingredients. Again, they're nice enough that we have no beginning work in process that we have to deal with. We'll see that next. You know, we can't avoid it completely, but when we have no beginning work in process, our life is so much easier. So this one has no beginning work in process. We started 90,000 quarts. 75,000 were transferred out, meaning they were completed. And then there's 15,000 in ending work in process. And then it gives us materials, labor, and overhead. Okay. And then it tells us dry materials are added throughout the process. Ending inventory is 60% complete with respect to direct labor and overhead. So at the ending inventory, when it says it's 60% complete with labor and overhead, those conversion costs, it's 100% complete with materials. So all the materials have been added in this working process to this point when they're finished. But the ending inventory is 60% complete for labor and overhead. which are those conversion costs. So again, we start out with, the same little reconciliation. We're going to start with units in beginning work in process, which we know to be 0. Always get so loud. And then we're going to add in units started. Well, in this case, they told us that was 90,000. So we have 90,000. So that's the total units we have to account for, are 90,000. Down here, we're going to do the same with, getting what was actually completed and transferred out and the ending work in process. So again, when you're calculating equivalent units of production, you're always doing it on the second part of the reconciliation. It's always off of what was completed and transferred out, plus what's still an ending work in process. Okay, so they told us 75,000 were transferred out. So units completed, the physical flow is actually 75,000. And equivalent units of production are always easy. They're always 100% when they're completed. So that's also 75,000. And then we have work in process, the ending work in process. And they told us that was 15,000, which would reconcile our total 90,000 units to account for, 75 plus 15. But they told me ending work in process is 60% complete. So what is my equivalent units for the ending work in process? 9,000, very good. So 15,000 times 60%. The equivalent units for ending is 9,000. So the total units completed in the period, or what we'll deem completed, would be 75,000 plus 9,000, or 84,000. Okay. So now we're going to take that 84,000 units that we could have completed, given all the resources we had, and be able to come up with a unit cost. Okay. So the next little section is dealing with costs, and we're not even doing the whole unit cost at this point. We're just reconciling costs. So we have beginning work in process, and there are 0 costs in beginning work in process. Okay. And then we have incurred during the period. Well, those costs they gave me up here, it's these 3 costs, the 84,000 plus 168 plus 336. So those are all the costs incurred in the current period. So how much are my total costs? How much? 588. Yeah, 588, very good. 588,000. Thank you. Okay. So then the total costs to account for are just the 588,000 because we had no beginning. Make that a little bit bigger. Okay. And we do a cost per unit. We do calculate that. I hate it when I say that. So divided by our equivalent units of 84,000. I'm like, I knew we had to. So then we just truly take our total costs divided by our equivalent units to get a cost per equivalent unit. Okay, so 588,000 divided by 84,000. So what's my cost per equivalent unit? $7, perfect. So now it's really easy to assign costs to both finished, goods and ending work in process because I have that unit cost. So once I'm able to get my equivalent units of production, I can easily take my cost for the period, divide them by that to get my cost per unit. So then to account for costs, we would start with goods transferred out. And we had, 75,000 goods that were finished and transferred out at $7 each. So how much was transferred out? Very good, 525,000. So again, I'm just taking the amount, the units that I transferred out, the 75,000, times the cost per equivalent unit of $7. So $525 of costs are going to be in finished goods. And then the ending work in process, it had equivalent units of 9,000, $7 each. So what, 63,000? So $63,000 are going to stay in that work in process and become beginning costs in the next period. And we just add those together to make sure we reconcile and that we've accounted for all $588,000. And those do add up to $588,000. So that's the production report for the mixing department. I guess it may not be transferred out to mixing, but it would go, you know, whatever was completed, the $525,000 would go into the next work in process. And then the mixing department would still have $63,000 costs remaining in it. Okay. So again, the whole purpose here is establishing equivalent units of production so we can calculate costs. What stays, what gets transferred out. Obviously, that's going to affect our sales price and everything else moving forward. Okay. Any questions on that? So that's what we call the production report. Okay. Let's see. So the last two are a little bit trickier and a little longer. Let's see. Because here we now have beginning work in process. So things do get a little trickier when we have beginning work in process because we have to figure out how we're going to handle that beginning work in process. So in the past example, we had nothing in beginning, so we didn't have to worry about how complete they were or what was going on with what was in there. So this one, we're doing FIFO method, first in, first out, which you may remember from good old inventory valuation, right? So we're assuming the first products that we, you know, put in production are the first ones sold, is really what that means. It's just the flow. And so this, it says, Jackson Products produces a barbecue sauce using 3 departments, cooking, mixing, and bottling. In the cooking department, all materials are added at the beginning of the process, which does make a difference. Output is measured in ounces, and the production data for July are as follows. So again, the FIFO process is just a little bit tricky because here we're really looking at, and I think the example is on page 2 of your notes. So if you refer to page 2 of your notes, the physical flow reconciliation is the same. You're still accounting for and calculating that the same. But equivalent units of production is where things change, okay? Because basically what we're looking at with FIFO is whatever's already in beginning work in process, we don't want to count those costs, those unit costs, okay? Because with FIFO, what we're looking at is we just want to look at this period's costs. So we want to get rid of any costs that came from last period. So we're excluding beginning work in process, which results in more accurate costs in the current period. It's just a little trickier to account for, but I think when we go through it, I don't think it's too bad, hopefully. We'll break it down, right? And it all depends on, you know, it can really get tricky when materials get added at different levels in the process and all that. So all the materials are added at the beginning of the process. So anything that's in work in process is already 100% complete as far as materials go. That's what that means, okay? So it tells us in production, units in process at the beginning of the month, we had 10,000 units that were 60% complete in regards to conversion, so labor and overhead. We completed and transferred out 80,000 units. And then ending inventory, we had 15,000 and they were 80% complete in regards to conversion, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is the physical flow schedule, okay? If you notice, they didn't tell us how many were started in the current period, so we have to calculate that. So that's the only part where I think it gets a little tricky on the physical flow schedule. So to be honest, it's actually easier to calculate what was started the actual units started and completed first, because we need that to calculate what was just started. So we're going to kind of fill in the blanks, and then I'll kind of show you what I mean. So we're still starting with the units in beginning, work in process. Okay. And that is 10,000. They gave us that. And then we're going to add in units started in July, but we don't know that number yet. Okay. And then down here, the first thing we want to calculate is what was actually started and completed. Or I'm sorry, transferred out total, everything that was completed. So we're going to take what was started and completed and add in our beginning work in process. Okay. Well, again, I know my beginning work in process was 10,000. Well, they didn't tell me what I started and completed. They just told me what was completed and transferred out. Well, with FIFO, they assume that anything that was in beginning gets completed in the period. So to figure out what was started, you're just going to take completed minus beginning work in process. Okay? So that'll tell us what was started. That's why I kind of work a little backwards on this one. So 70,000 units were started and completed. 80,000 were completed total, but 10 of those were from beginning work in process. Okay. Which gets us, again, the 80,000 is what was started and completed. So they gave us the 80,000 and they gave us the 10,000. So you just kind of have to work backwards on this one, and try to make it a little trickier, I guess. And so to figure out what was started in July, okay, what was started in July, we're going to take the 70,000 that were started and completed, and we're going to add in our ending work in process. So that'll tell us the units that we started in July, okay? So we're going to take our started and completed, the 70,000, plus ending work in process of 15,000. So that tells us I'm sorry, that was 85,000. 85,000 units were started during July. So 70,000 were started and completed, and we had 15 left. So all total, we had 85,000 units started in July. So then we can kind of fill in the rest. Total units to account for are the 95,000. We got the units started and transferred out, and we just need to account for what's an ending work in process down here, which is 15,000. So that would be 95,000. Okay. So it depends on the information they give you. Sometimes you have to backtrack and think in a different way to get those answers. Are there any questions on that? They just, gave it to us a little differently there. So we have 95,000 total units to account for. We've reconciled that. And then it wants us to do an equivalent unit schedule using FIFO method. Well, how that works is we're going to start with units started and completed. And that we know was 70,000, both in respect for materials and conversion costs. 70,000 units were started and finished. Okay. So that's the same. But then you see when we start doing equivalent units of production, the wording changes a little. So it says add units in beginning work in process times the percentage to complete. So we only want to figure out how much we still have to complete. We don't want to consider the work that's already been done. So we had 10,000 units in beginning work in process. Okay, so that's for both materials and conversion. 10,000 units. Well, again, we want to not worry about any costs that were already associated with those. Well, materials were added already. Remember, materials were 100% complete. So these 10,000 units don't need any more materials. So I'm going to multiply it by 0 because there's no percentage left to complete. They are 100% complete. So there are no equivalent units indirect materials and beginning work in process. Okay. But for conversion costs, we were what, 60% complete? So how much more would I need to add? 40. Very good. So I'm going to multiply it by 40. And so my conversion costs, equivalent units, would be 4,000. Okay. So when we deal with FIFO, we have to figure out how much it would take to finish off or complete those that are in beginning work in process. So it's really, you know, if they're 100% complete, it takes nothing more to complete them. Any questions on that? That's where FIFO gets tricky, because you're calculating what it takes to finish those that are in beginning. And then your ending really works the same at this point. You had 15,000 units. And they told us of those in ending work in process, you know, they were already 100% complete in regards to materials. So that would just be the 15,000. And then in regards to conversion, and it would be 80%. So it'd be what, 12,000? 12,000. So to calculate equivalent units of output, we're just going to add for materials. We had 70,000 plus 0 plus 15,000. So 85,000, right? And that's all of them that we had available in the period. Or all that were started and completed, I guess I should say, right? Sort of different. And then for conversion costs, we have 70 plus 4 plus 12. So we would have, what, 86,000. Okay. So that's where it gets a little tricky, because you have to figure out what it would take to finish off what's in beginning. But then your equivalent units for your ending works just like it does under average, the weighted average method. Okay? So you just add all that up and you get your equivalent units of output for materials and for conversion costs. And then from there, you know, if we had total costs, we could calculate the cost per unit for materials and for conversion. Let's see, the last little thing just is a what if. What if 60% of the materials were added at the beginning of the process and 40% were added at the end of the process? Well, they like to make it tricky, right? So really what's changing there is, let's see, up here, you know, it would take, what they said, 60%. Yeah, so what we would change there basically is these would be 60% complete. So they would now be 40% complete, right? Or 40% to complete. We'll write it on the board. How about that? It gets a little confusing when I start into complete, not complete. So we had 10,000. And this is just with materials. If they were 60% complete, it would take 40% to complete them, right? So we would still have the 70,000 up here. I think my green marker works better. I know you can't see that. So we would have 4,000 in beginning, the 70 for those that were completed and transferred out. So that's beginning. And then in ending, they were then 60% complete. So it'd come down to the 15,000. And those that were in ending work in process would be the 60% complete. Okay, so it would take the 15,000 times the 60%. Which, what's 60% of 15,000? 9,000? Thank you. So if 60% were added at the beginning work in process would need 40% more to complete it. So there would still be some costs associated there. And then the ending work in process would be 60% complete. And so we would just add those up. So my equivalent units of production would go to 83,000. So it just gets a little tricky, right? I'm like, okay, we have to really think about that one. Any questions on that? Okay, so just remember when you use FIFO, you have to calculate the cost to finish out whatever's in beginning work in process. Okay, that's the difference. But we can check that one. And we're on our last one, yay! And then we'll be out for spring break, yay! You can take a mind break maybe a little bit, or work ahead, you know. If you're like me, it's like split, right? I'm like, for my spring break, I usually take like a 3 or 4 days and I don't look at anything, and then I get back on it, so. Otherwise, I come back on that next Monday. Have you ever done that? I know I do. I come back at school to say I feel like I'm the same as a student. I come back and I'm like, what am I doing today? What class do I have? Like that week off really throws me off. So if you'll notice, this is the same information: Jackson products, barbecue sauce, cooking, mixing, bottling. Same production. So 60% complete in beginning as far as conversion costs, same exact data. So now we're really just able to compare truly FIFO method to the weighted average method. Okay, so we're going to do the weighted average method. So the only thing, again, with the weighted average method is it's easier to calculate, but it's not as accurate because you are considering all the costs. So you're actually adding in costs. You know, in this beginning work in process, the costs we've already incurred last period are added in this period. So it's just not a true representation of the period cost. Weighted average, it's just like inventory. Over time, you get, you know, a nice smooth out function as far as your costs go. But if you were really interested, if your costs were changing drastically from one period to the next, your costs could be really inaccurate under weighted average method, because you are considering prior period cost. And so it depends again on the nature of the business when they're looking at which method they would use. If their period costs are pretty similar month to month, weighted average really wouldn't have a big impact on their costing. Okay, so it just depends on the structure. But let's take a look. We're going to do another physical flow schedule, but honestly, this is the exact same as we just did. So we get to kind of breeze through it. So just like the last time, we had units in beginning work in process, and we have 10,000. And then units started during July. Well, again, you could recalculate all that, but it should be 85,000, just like it was last time. We already took those calculations. So all my units to account for are 95,000. Of those, we started and completed 70,000. And we had beginning of 10,000. So we had 80,000 units that were completed and transferred out. And then we have an ending work in process of 15,000. So total units to account for, again, is the 95,000. Again, we get a nice shortcut. Your homework, you know, with it being algorithmic, you'll probably have to recalculate those. You'll get different numbers. But to save time in here, it helps. And we don't have to redo the same thing. Okay, so our physical flow schedule, again, under FIFO and weighted average, it's the exact same. Okay, it doesn't change. But here's where things change. Notice here you only have to calculate ending work in process. So we don't really even have to do anything with the beginning work in process. So makes life easier. So here we are going to look at units completed, which units completed and transferred out were the 80,000. So that stays the same. Okay. Units completed and transferred out were 80,000. And then we just need to calculate the equivalent units of production for what's an ending work in process. Well, again, it tells us 15,000 units. It told us materials were added at the beginning. So our materials are 100% complete, not 1,000, 100. So we have 15,000 of ending materials. And we were 80% complete in regards to conversion. So there we have 12,000. So our equivalent units of output are 95,000 for materials, just everything from the period, right? All the materials we had. And conversion was 92,000. Well, if you remember from the last problem, those were in the 80s, like 85 and 86. So you can see that's where the big difference is. We get a different equivalent units of production, which changes how costs get assigned in the period, you know? So then just for fun, it says, what if you were to calculate the FIFO, what if you were asked to calculate FIFO units beginning with the weighted average equivalent units? So calculate the weighted average equivalent units by subtracting out prior period output found in beginning work in process. It's a lot of words, right? All you have to do is you are going to take your equivalent units of output under the weighted average and subtract out equivalent units for the beginning work in process, okay? Well, again, thankfully we had already calculated that. Go back and find it here. Well, yeah, those are the answers. You got it. Very good. I was just trying to figure out, I was remembering how to get to the answers. Let's see. We had, we had equivalent units used in beginning work in process. I just need to scroll up. 10,000, right? We had 10,000 units. Yeah, 10,000 units in beginning work in process. So for direct materials for FIFO, we would just take the 95,000 minus the 10,000 units. So you just subtract out your equivalent units of production from beginning work in process. So beginning work in process, for materials was 100%. So we had 10,000. And then for conversion, it was 60% or 6,000 equivalent units of production. So we would have to go back up and look at our beginning work in process. And we would just take what we got under weighted and subtract out the beginning work in process equivalent units of production. So for materials, it's 95,000 minus that 10,000. For conversion, we would take the 92,000 minus the 6,000 and get the 86,000, which matches what we got under the FIFO method in the last example. Okay? So you take your equivalent units of output under weighted average and subtract out beginning work in process equivalent units of production. I was looking to see, I don't think I had that on your notes. No. So that might be something you might want to write down for your notes. So if you wanted to convert to figure out your equivalent units of production under FIFO, if you go from weighted average, you would take equivalent units of output minus beginning work in process equivalent units of production. So, no, you're fine. I know it's a lot. So you would take your equivalent units that you calculated minus the beginning work in process equivalent units.
So it's the 10% for 10,000 and 60% of that.
Yes, yeah. So for materials, it's the full 10,000 because materials are added at the beginning. And for conversion, yeah, 60% or 6,000. So you could do the opposite to go from FIFO to weighted average. You know, you could kind of go both ways. You just or add in that case instead of subtract. Any questions on any of that? You guys feeling pretty good about it? Hopefully you'll be able to follow the notes and then this example, and it'll make, hopefully it makes sense. I think, again, it's one of those concepts that if you've had managerial more recently, it makes more sense. And I know a lot of you haven't. So it's like trying to remember things, you know, that you did several semesters or years ago. It makes it a little trickier. Because in managerial, we did cover process costing. We just did the weighted average method. So we did equivalent units. Yeah, it's just a little, I don't remember if we ever did any beginning work in process, though. We kind of kept it simple in there. You guys have anything for me? You guys good? All right, well, I'm finished. Just remember chapter 5 homework tonight. And then when we get back from spring break, we'll pick up with the next chapter.